For 7 years, I was the HR lead, the HR director for the Olympic Delivery Authority. So the Olympic Delivery Authority wasn't civil service, it was a non-departmental public body that was attached via sort of our reporting lines into the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, as was then. So the non-departmental public body, the Olympic Delivery Authority, had £8 billion. So again, it's got a billion on the end of it, to spend on developing and delivering the infrastructure. So the venues, the infrastructure, essentially the Olympic Park and other things were built through this vehicle. So this public sector organisation working against immovable deadlines to deliver a major programme of activity. And when we started this work, so I started in 2006. There was a feeling across the country that this was an enormous project, that actually were we able to deliver on it as a country, including the question about it coming through a public into private sector interface. It's hard to remember that now because we all look back at it with the lens of the games and how fantastic it was, etc., etc. But in the beginning, it was in the middle of the whole Wembley Stadium. We can't even build one stadium. How are we going to do this? And so the Olympic Delivery Authority had like £8 billion of public funding of a £9 billion public envelope. So some of it was on policing and so forth. Some of it was contingency. And then the £2 billion that LOCOG, who put on the games and did a fantastic job, absolutely fantastic job. They raised their money through ticketing, revenue, sponsorship deals and so on. But they staged the games and we built the venues. Does that make sense? So this is an excerpt from the people strategy that we put together at the very beginning. So actually that was a 2007 people strategy. So necessity to hit dates and budget, public accountability and scrutiny, management of one of the largest, most complex infrastructure programs and transportation projects, because the interface was directly into the construction sector and the transportation sector. So 250 direct employees that were public employees interfacing with a delivery partner, which was a consortium from the private sector, CH2M, Hill, Lango, Rourke and Mace, coming together as the delivery partner underneath, and then managing into a supply chain that at peak on the games had 12,500 people working on site. So it's this thing about being a thin an intelligent client and having that capability that means that you can interface with and manage into, and that if you go back to some of those principles of what does commerciality means, it means being able to work with delivery partners across that interface. So that's the next bullet point: partnership working leading into the supply chain, managing different organisational phases, because it had a beginning, middle and end, including an operating bit at the end where the games work seamlessly against a very tight sort of handover period. Delivering high performance. Maintaining a brand reputation. Again, these are things that you would expect to see in the private sector, and also, but the brand around the kind of international brand reputation was created while we were building the venues and infrastructure, and then became sort of augmented in the lead up to the games. By the time the torch relay happened, you were already seeing quite a strong brand reputation, and that had all been built on this successful delivery of the venues and infrastructure. That's a quick high level of the bucket of stuff that we had in our people strategy. We publish on our Learning Legacy page what that looked like in practice. I'm really happy to take any questions around that. But when you look at that, you go, well, actually, that's not really a million miles different from many of the things that you would expect to see in other organisations. We put that together in 2007, before the financial downturn. So I was going around talking to people to say, who's doing exiting people really well? Because we were starting an organisation that was going to have a beginning, middle and end. How are you attracting in people? What terms and conditions can you put together? How does it work with your supply chain? How are you going to grow and change your resource base when you go from procurement into commissioning, into delivery? What you need in the beginning of a major project is very different from what you need in the middle and at the end. And so we were already thinking about, if you bring people on board, how do you do that knowing that they're going to exit at the end? So things like that were unusual at the time, less unusual now, particularly now we're in a more of a sort of a different cycle economically, and there are more of these major programs like Crossrail and Tideway and others. At the time there were less of those, but some of those other things, reward, well-being, you would expect to see anywhere. And then this is an excerpt from, we said we're going to measure things really simply. We're only going to report on things that we think will be helpful, partly because time was incredibly precious, so you only did the things that you thought were helpful. And I've just put in red there the ones that I think have got a direct read into commercial. I think you can argue that everything around that strategy was a commercial approach, but so some of the things on workforce costs, I've already described the supply chain. It was quite complicated, so you had to think very commercially about where you're going to get your best value for money from, and that might mean that you were not actually directly hiring in, or it might mean that you were, and you were hiring in on a different basis than would normally exist in the public sector. So, for example, we had a very good, appropriate performance-related pay system, because it's a project delivery system. That is not typical of what you get in the public sector. So some of the things about reward and benchmarking and external research on what was going on in the sector, monitoring turnover, etc., and the hitting time and budget concerns and so on. And so for me, I know I'm slightly biased. For me, this is an example of a commercial public sector-led delivery, public sector-led. It was a complete partnership across the supply chain. Couldn't have been done without working with the delivery partner in the way that we did. Couldn't have been done without the extraordinary leadership that we had from our board and other colleagues. Couldn't have been done without working all the way down the supply chain to the chippies that were doing the various trades and so forth were involved. The first picture is when we've already acquired the site, because when I first did my tour of the Olympic Park, it was there's that industrial estate over there, and you see where that pylon is over there. That is going to be the entrance to the Olympic Stadium. So what you see there, this is the Olympic Stadium site. This is the aquatic centre site. The rest of it is the north of the park. You can see the waterways, how intricate that is. It was a very contaminated area. And what you had there was multiple relationships with first-tier contractors. So the organisation building the Olympic Stadium was different from the organisation designing and building the aquatic centre, for example. So you had these multiple commercial relationships, quite often potentially in conflict with each other, working on a very small area of land with all of the disruption that would have had on the external relationships with your local people and so on and so on. So it's a very complicated a bit of delivery that the team did there. That's about 2008 then, so it's about the time of the Beijing Games. You can see the piling going in for the Olympic Stadium there, so we're already starting to see the foundations of that. The picture on the right is in 2011. So that's the Olympic Stadium a year before the Games. And the reason I put that picture up, because I love it, is because our fantastic people that work in on parklands have already planted what the plants, what the environment's going to look like at the Games time the following year. So they already know that is going to be the visitor experience. Does that make sense? So actually being able to then hand over to local so that they could do the testing and so on, all of this programme of activity was very well coordinated by colleagues. Some questions, some broader questions around, so the kind of the so what kind of questions then. And these questions are sort of a bunch of things that you can get from reading business strategy stuff and things that have occurred to me as well. So the thing about how, and these are questions for me as well as everybody else, how do you choose to spend your time? And how does it relate to the business strategy? How much of your time do you spend internally versus externally? How far ahead of the curve are you in terms of the initiatives that will shape your organisation? In a programme environment, you need to be X period of time ahead. If you look too far ahead, you don't know exactly where you're going to be going, so you can make some decisions that are the wrong decisions, but you need to look sufficiently ahead from a business strategy perspective for certain things, because some of those things have got a really long lead time, and some of those things, the decisions you're making on a major program are about 6 months before that you need to move on certain things. So how much are you thinking and planning from an HR perspective? Can you actually describe the impact you've had, and how have you measured it? And in the public sector context, how can you demonstrate you've delivered value for money, risk, etc., etc. And then on a major program, this thing about how do you engage with your wider workforce. And there are some organisations where HR is about the headcount of the organisation, the direct employees, and then there's this real distance between supply chains. There are other organisations, manufacturing, for example, or in other contexts, where actually you look at your total workforce and you influence into that in terms of your values and your policies and so on and so on and so on.